Dr. John here with NBC News on his Facebook Live, covering some coronavirus headlines you might have heard over the last couple of days, just to go over the information, get below the headlines, and get the information out there so you can understand that headline a little bit better. And on top of that, answering some viewer questions. So please, if you have any questions, go ahead and send them my way. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible. And honestly, I have to tell you, you guys have fantastic questions that really get to the meat and potatoes of what's going on here with coronavirus and what we need to do to get out of this pandemic and to stay safe. But first, let me cover the headlines. First and foremost, the headline everybody's talking about today is the vaccine, the information coming out of a vaccine trial. Now, as of now, according to the World Health Organization, there are 23 companies that are in clinical trials for vaccines. There are well over 100 companies trying to develop a vaccine. 23 of those are in human trials. The ones that are most advanced are the Moderna one and what people are calling the Oxford vaccine. Today, the information came out from the Oxford vaccine, and it's some good news, at least this far into the trial. The University of Oxford has teamed with AstraZeneca, and they've developed this vaccine. They've pushed it through what they're calling a phase 1/2 trial, which means it's kind of halfway between both of them. They are continuing phase 2 and phase 3 trials in the UK and in Brazil to try and get more information. But with this trial, what they did, again, a phase 1/2 trial, is they had a little over 1,000 participants. Of those 1,000 participants, they ended up getting 543 of them were given the COVID vaccine. 534 were given a meningococcal vaccine, which has been around for a long time. Those were the control group to find out if they weren't getting the same reactions and they weren't getting the same results as the COVID-19 vaccine. And that's important that they had that control group because that tells them what the vaccine is doing and what it's not doing and how safe it is overall. What they found out is, first and foremost, as they described it, has acceptable safety profiles and no serious adverse events. And I'll explain that in a minute. But from the results of this, what they found out are two different things. One is it's kind of the double punch when it comes to vaccines and what they can do for the body. And what this one does is it gives them that double punch, at least in this small trial, that could be very effective at getting the coronavirus pandemic and the coronavirus virus under control. What they found out is it does two things. One, it actually causes the body to create antibodies. That's important because if the virus is circulating through the body, in the bloodstream, the lymph system, those antibodies can attack it and they can get it under control. That's important. But perhaps even more important is it also causes the bodies to develop what are called helper T cells. Now, the T cells are kind of our sentinel cells in our immune system, and they sit out there and they hunt for any kind of virus that they're attuned to. So if they're specifically tuned to hunt for coronavirus, once they see it, then they start nudging the immune system to develop those antibodies so it can fight off the virus. And so that's why helper T cells are so important. Now, we do know that at this point, it looks like antibodies from coronavirus seem to wane over time. 3 or 4 months seems to be that time period when they start decreasing. What we don't know is what that means. But what this vaccine trial shows us the results is it gives us some hope that even though those antibodies are decreasing over time, having those helper T cells in the background that are constantly surveilling for that virus, once that virus hits again, they can develop the antibodies. That's important because you don't necessarily have to have the antibodies. You just have to have something that can develop them very, very quickly and very specifically for coronavirus in this case. The example I'll give you, measles. If you get a measles titer, which measures your antibodies, it might come out as not detectable or not high enough to give you the antibody protection they think you need. But one thing we do know with measles is it does develop those helper T cells, the vaccine. And so once people get measles and the virus hits their body, boom, those helper T cells talk the immune system into actually developing the antibodies, and they can go ahead and get rid of it. So with measles, if you've had the MMR vaccine, even if you're undetectable in titers, the common thought now is that you're still protected from measles. We think that might be the same thing here. And why this is important, because one, it'll offer you protection, but also it'll make it so that if we do have to get booster shots, which we may not, but if we do, they can be spaced further apart, as in years apart, so they don't have to be quite as often as some people are thinking it might happen. So as of now, the vaccines we're looking at that we've gotten good results from, the Moderna vaccine, the Oxford vaccine, which is paired with AstraZeneca, and there's actually a Chinese vaccine as well that came out, and that's showing antibody results too, and that information came out today as well. Difference being the way these vaccines are developed. For those science geeks out there, the Oxford AstraZeneca one, it actually used a chimpanzee adenovirus that was what we call attenuated, so it can't actually give that virus to the person, but it can deliver the vaccine in the virus form, which is important. The Chinese one used a human coronavirus that they had weakened. The difference there being that the human coronavirus one the Chinese used, they're not getting nearly the reaction they were hoping for, a lot of experts were hoping for, mainly because they think that since it's a human coronavirus, a lot of humans already have antibodies to it, so they fight it off as soon as they see it, which doesn't give it time to produce its own immune system responses. So again, vaccine, great news today, but this is again a phase 1, phase 2 trial. They're doing phase 2 and phase 3 trials. The important news is we're hearing that now it looks like a lot of experts are starting to kind of fine-tune it down to where they think we'll have the vaccine by the end of the year, hopefully. But what they're doing right now, and I've talked about this in the past, is they're actually revving up the distribution system. They're going to start producing the vaccine very quickly here while they're doing these trials. If the trials pass, if they get FDA approval, then they're good to go. If they don't get FDA approval, then they're just going to eat the cost of these trials. Some of them the government might eat the cost, some of them the company. But the important part is they're trying to get the vaccine out as soon as possible, so hopefully by the end of the year. Now, distribution is going to be another issue, and distribution I'll talk about in subsequent Facebook Lives, but essentially what they're looking at now is healthcare workers and the most vulnerable are going to be the ones that are initially going to get it, because there's only going to be probably a few 100 million doses initially, and then eventually everybody will be getting it. This phase 3 trial is going to expand the age group. Right now it's 18 to 55 for the phase 1-2 trial. The phase 2 and 3 trials are going to expand it more so they can get more elderly children. They can look at those and people with certain health conditions to make sure it works for them as well. So that's one of the news stories, the vaccine. On top of that, there's also a story came out showing that children can end up passing coronavirus a little more than we thought they could, at least certain age groups. What they found in this very robust South Korean study looking at school children and their families is that for children under the age of 10, they don't pass the virus on nearly as much as adults. As a matter of fact, it's half the level of adults. The reason they think this is happening is because children, if you think about it, are much, much shorter than we are, and they don't breathe as heavily as we do. And since they don't breathe as heavily because their bodies are smaller, that virus doesn't come out quite as far. And if we're much taller than they are, we're not going to get the virus in our face, which is where it gets into our body. With adults, older teens, it happens more often. So what they found out is 10-year-olds and above end up passing it on, 10-year-olds to 19-year-olds in this study, as much, if not more, than adults. The reason it's if not more than adults is because the behavior patterns. They tend to not social distance. They tend to get very close to each other. They tend to share drinks. They tend to share those things and not necessarily do the safety procedures we know are important. So that's why they think they're passing it. Not that they're spewing more virus out there, but they're just not doing the behaviors that we know that can keep people safe. So again, what the study found is that under the age of 10, half the amount of spread that adults do. Above the age of 10 to 19, as much, if not more, than adults, which has implications for opening schools. And basically, it's back to what happens when you open schools. You need to make sure you do it safely. That means social distancing, wearing masks, at least the older adults wearing masks, or the older children wearing masks, to keep the students, the staff, the teachers, and their families all very, very healthy during this whole event here. And what we're seeing now with school openings is that some schools are going to open slower. They're going to do distance learning, so I'm going to do combinations. There's no one solution. There's some creative solutions being discussed right now, so time will tell how that works and how successful it is. But on that note, what we're also finding out is if you look at Europe for a while there was the epicenter of the pandemic, especially Spain, Italy, UK. A lot of issues. Well, right now, Spain and Italy in particular have a decrease in cases, an incredible decrease in cases, even though they've opened up their economies. Same thing with Germany. Even though they've opened up their economies, they're not having the cases we are here in the U.S. Scientists have looked at this, researchers have looked at this. They think the reason behind this is behavior pattern. In Europe, they're much more likely to wear masks and social distance. They've gotten that message from their government. That's what's needed to be done to keep things safe. Here in the U.S., that message hasn't gotten across, especially to the younger populations, the younger adults. We know they're congregating more in bars and other spaces and spreading it that way. So the concern is, are we going to follow the model we keep going here, or are we going to follow more the European model where they have opened successfully and they're getting things more and more better under control? So again, just to revamp what the topics are today, the headlines. Number one, the vaccine. Great news from the Oxford study about their vaccine, the clinical trials, but there's still a ways to go. Hopefully, vaccine by the end of the year. Like I said, 23 in human trials right now. We're getting great information on those. They're showing to be safe and effective, which is important. South Korea, a study on school students found that under the age of 10, they don't spread it nearly as much as adults. Above the age of 10, they spread it as much, if not more than adults. A lot of it has to do with behaviors. And U.S. versus Europe, a tale of two different areas. Here, even though we've reopened, cases are going up. There, even though they've reopened, cases are not going up. It has to do with human behavior. So let me see if you have any questions.
Do the red zone states, will any of that affect back to school?
So the question is, will the red zone states, will any of that affect back to school? As of last count, there are 18 red zone states, and this is something the government has come out with. The way they define red zone states is if the cases of coronavirus are 100 per 100,000 population or more, or if they have a positivity rate higher than 10%, or a combination of the two, then they're considered a red zone state. So again, 100 per 100,000 cases of coronavirus or a positivity rate greater than 10%. That means they have high levels of coronavirus, and so they need to consider measures to bring those levels down. Measures including rolling back reopenings, mandating masks, those types of things that some states are doing at this point. As far as schools, the current recommendation from all the experts I've talked to is if you're not in a hot zone, then there are safe ways to open schools. But if you're in a hot zone, which a red zone state could be considered close to being a hot zone, you need to consider how you're going to do this. And that means either not opening up right away, rolling through the opening schools so that less students come back and you eventually bring all the students back at some point when it's safer. But the main thing to remember here is if you're in a red zone state, then you have high levels of cases. You need to make sure you get those under control before you bring students back. Otherwise, it's difficult to keep them, their families, and their loved ones safe. So again, the time will tell how those states do. If they can get it under control, they can open up sooner. If not, they'll have to open up later. See if there's any other questions.
Is COVID-19 the same for everyone? Has there been different strains?
So the question is COVID-19 the same for everyone? I'll answer this two different ways. As far as the symptoms we've learned over months can vary among people. The biggest symptoms are fevers, cough, and chest pain are the biggest symptoms people have. Otherwise, there are symptoms, abdominal issues, diarrhea, gastrointestinal issues, people losing their sense of smell, their sense of taste, neurological issues, people getting headaches, getting neurological findings, tingling, sometimes numbness, stroke-like symptoms, which need immediate care, meaning go to the hospital right away or call 911. But as far as the symptoms, they vary person to person. Now, as far as the virus itself mutating, the nature of viruses is viruses constantly change, and that's why viruses are so tough to fight. But as the World Health Organization puts it, there have been no findings of significant changes. And that significant change is what we look for, because that means this virus is attacking us a different way that we can't fight the same way we're planning to fight this one. Now, there has been some news out there about the original virus in China versus the virus that came out of the U.S. and Europe. The virus that came out of the U.S. and Europe seems to be more contagious, but not as deadly as the virus that came out of China. The virus that came out of China, not as contagious, but more deadly. So that is a small change in the virus, not a mutation that's significant enough to cause it to be a different virus or a different type of virus that we're going to have to fight differently. So again, even though these viruses constantly change, they constantly mutate. That's what viruses do. There's been no significant change or mutation in the virus to cause us to look at it in a different way or from a different angle or try to attack it differently.
Is it possible to get COVID-19 more than once?
So the question is it possible to get COVID-19 more than once? And I think the genesis behind this question is there's been some news recently about people that tested positive, ended up recovering, tested negative even multiple times, and then testing positive again, or having symptoms, getting better, and getting symptoms again. What we think is happening, we don't think they're catching it a second time. There's been no indication of anybody catching coronavirus twice. Catching it once from somebody, getting better, and then catching it again from somebody completely different. We don't think that's happening. What we think is happening is one of a few things. One, either, the obvious one is the testing was bad. So when it was negative, it really wasn't negative. Number two is we think that it's possible that the virus inside their body was dormant and then reactivated, and that's why they tested positive. But then their immune system is able to fight it off. Number 3 is the tests are sophisticated enough to where they're finding viral particles. In other words, they're finding parts of the virus that's able to amplify and make positive on that test, but it's not finding virus parts. The reason they're saying this is happening is because they're getting that same blood sample or that same nasal sample. They're trying to grow the virus in the lab. The virus is not growing. So it's not a viable virus, but it's certainly a virus that is detectable through these tests. And so we think a combination of those things might be happening, not that somebody catching a virus a second time from somebody else. Again, once you get coronavirus, you recover from it. For most healthy people, you develop antibodies, which protects you from it, but we don't know how long that protection lasts. And that's why we say everybody still needs to wear masks and social distance.
Is it possible to be immune to this virus?
So the question is, and this kind of segues onto that one, is it possible to be immune to this virus? It's the same thing. The immunity comes from antibodies. And so once you get COVID-19, you develop those antibodies. To a certain extent, you have an immunity to this virus. We don't know how long that immunity lasts. We don't know how many antibodies you need, what level of them we need. What it looks like is people with mild symptoms don't have antibodies as robust or that last as long as people with more severe symptoms that have recovered from COVID-19. Again, we're not sure what that means. Helper T cells that I talked about earlier are in there. If those helper T cells are in there, it might allow the immune system to gin up those antibodies so they can take control of the immune system and fight off COVID-19. Still a lot of unknowns. This virus has been around for around 6+ months, and so we're still learning more as we go. Fantastic questions. Thank you so much for all the questions. Again, to go over the headlines real quick. Number 1, Europe versus the U.S. Big differences in reopening and the cases that have cropped up. The experts think that has to do with the fact that in Europe, they tend to do more of the masks, social distancing, listening to the healthcare experts there, what they need to do, whereas in the U.S. isn't happening quite as much. Number 2, in South Korea, study was done looking at school children, and from this study, which was a good study, children under the age of 10 don't pass on the virus nearly as much as adults. Children 10 to 19 pass them on as much, if not more so than adults. The if not more so part is because their behavior patterns lead them to be closer to each other, not necessarily doing the social distancing or mask wearing that we talk about that can keep everybody protected. And then finally, the vaccine news out of the University of Oxford and AstraZeneca vaccine trials, which are showing us that their vaccine in a phase 1, phase 2 trial of 1,000 people is producing antibodies and helper T cells, which can hopefully help fight this off. We'll get more information when they do their phase 2 and phase 3 trials, as we will from all the other vaccine trials that are going on. The hope is we get this beginning of next year. A lot of experts are now saying it might be possible at the end of this year. So keep your fingers crossed that happens, because this is going to be the thing that's going to really help us get this pandemic under control. In the meanwhile, the things you can do to help get it under control, the things I always talk about, and yes, they're extremely boring, but they do work. Wearing masks, social distancing, small groups, 10 or less, especially in social situations, and then lots of hand washing. That's what we can all do to help keep things under control. In the meanwhile, I hope you have a fantastic week. And as always, stay happy and stay healthy.